Hi, I want to welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Procopi. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, better known as PAR. We are a nonpartisan state policy watchdog and research organization. This is part of our monthly webinar. I also want to be talking. We will be talking about the five constitutional amendments on the May 16th election. So that's coming up fairly shortly. I also want to thank our sponsor, B1 Bank, who helps support this and makes this webinar possible. So thank them very much. They are great partners to have. All right, so we have our regular panel to talk about constitutional amendments. I will say before I start, we touch a lot on our webinar, touch on a lot of important topics. This is the one I always look forward to and have the most fun with because I'm friends with everyone on the panel and enjoy them, even though they have a diverse, or maybe even because they have a diverse set of views. So today, our gang of regulars: Barry Erwin, Chief Policy Officer of Leaders for a Better Louisiana; Daniel Erspamer, CEO of the Pelican Institute for Public Policy. They focus on individual liberty and free enterprise; and Jan Moller, Executive Director of Invest in Louisiana. They work on public policy, but with a focus on how it affects low and moderate income families. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be
All right.
here.
A review for everyone in terms of what the format is. This is slightly different than how we do other ones. For each amendment, I will give a very high level overview. It will pain me to leave out some of these details, and I might even put some in there, and Melinda will have to hassle me if I do. Um, and then for the sake of time, we just have to. Then I'll leave the details to y'all, and then Melinda will sort of lead the conversation, asking y'all questions. What's your take? And then basically y'all help fill through the details and work through the arguments so that the citizens will have a better idea what's going on. All right. One other formatting question. For those people, put your questions that have questions, put them in the Q&A, and then Melinda will go through. If we get them in time, we might ask them while we're going through. Otherwise, we'll take questions, we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end. Always get your questions in early, and if you can, put the amendment number. Um, that helps a lot and helps Melinda sort of stay organized. All right, y'all ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Amendment number one, civil service. Let's see, we have our. Okay. You support amendment to allow the legislature to remove or add officers, positions, and employees to the unclassified civil service. So here's the thing. Most state employees are in the classified system, but civil service has two classes. They have the classified system and the unclassified system. The classified system is where they have a lot of protections. They have to be hired on a competitive basis. There's a pay schedule that they move through, and if they are disciplined or fired, there's a due process that they have to go through that, as opposed to unclassified employees who are more like at-will employees in the private sector. This would currently, I should say, there's a civil service commission that can move people from the classified system to the unclassified system. This amendment would allow the legislature to do the same thing. So the legislature, via a bill, can move people out, not necessarily people, but positions and employees to the unclassified service. And if they move someone out, the Civil Service Commission cannot move them back in. All right, so that's a high level view. There's a lot going on with civil service, but let's start with that.
Okay, so I am going to start with Daniel because I believe Pelican supports this amendment. So can you talk through why you are supportive of it and what your hope is would change with this?
Absolutely. Thanks, Melinda. Thanks, Stephen, of course, and Par for all your great work. Yeah, we support Amendment One. As you look at separation of powers and how these programs work in other states and the federal government and how they work well and work poorly sometimes. This is a situation, for those not familiar with civil service, it was really brought in as a means to protect state government or other government employees from political pressure. We have a little bit of history of that here in Louisiana. But in this case, the challenge with the current system is it's not accountable to the people's elected representatives in the legislature. So members or presidents of private universities around Louisiana make recommendations to the governor. That's who makes up the Civil Service Board, and one member is elected by the workers that are covered under civil service. So this really puts more checks and balances into the system, gives the legislature the authority to make some of these decisions. And importantly, this does not change at all the civil service system or its sort of merit-based protections. It just changes who has the ability to make decisions about classified and unclassified employees.
Okay. And Jan, I believe Invest in Louisiana is opposed to this one. So can you talk through what your concerns are here?
Sure. And first I want to thank Par for bringing us together. You know, we all get stuck in our echo chambers sometimes, and it's great to have a forum where people with different views can air them. Uh, Daniel was right that the civil service was created to guard against political patronage. And the question here is, do we want politicians deciding who should be an appointed official? When you're in the unclassified civil service, it means that you're a political appointee. You can be fired for any reason whatsoever, or no reason at all. And absolutely, elected officials, governors, and cabinet secretaries should have the right to appoint top officials who share their political views. But the reason you have a civil service is so that there is expertise, nonpartisan, non-political expertise that cuts across administrations. These are your civil servants who have real protections so that they can keep their jobs. They are career professionals in most cases, and giving politicians more authority to decide who should be these at-will political appointees, I think just takes us in the wrong direction, takes us closer to the days when political patronage ruled who gets to serve in state government. So that's our problem with it.
Okay. Barry, we have a question that I'm hopeful you might be able to help us with, because I know Leaders for a Better Louisiana hasn't taken a position on this amendment. Someone is asking, would the Civil Service Commission and the legislature essentially have equal authority under this amendment to remove jobs from classified civil service and make them unclassified? And do you have an understanding of how this would work with the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally you could say that it looks like in that one narrow area that we're talking about, removing somebody from the classified service or returning them, I guess, later, that they do have basically equal kind of power there. But again, as you pointed out, or Stephen did, you know, if the legislature removes somebody, it makes them unclassified. They're the only ones that can put them back. So they're limited in what they can do in those areas. But basically, it's basically the same function that they're able to do. As to how it would work, I think that's one of the questions about this is really all it does is say the legislature can do this. It can make these positions unclassified. It doesn't say how you would implement that or how you would do that. It doesn't even say how many or how broadly they could look at that. So, I mean, I think that's one of the questions that's out there. It's one thing if you take one or two positions, which is kind of what happens with civil service now, and make them, you know, unclassified. But if you took a whole swath of people, like large amounts, it does raise some questions about how it would actually be implemented that this doesn't really answer.
Yep. Just and Barry, real quick, y'all will take a position, but you have said, basically, if this passes, there's some work that needs to be done, and if this fails, this needs to be work to be done. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think I was kind of hitting on like trying to do a little bit about that. I mean, I think our folks feel like there is a need to take a look at civil service and maybe do some reforms. I think we have questions whether this is the way to go. I think, even if this passes, we need to have something, the legislature, somebody's going to have to come in and look at how they would actually do this implementation that we were just talking about and looking at some of the issues that it might raise. And I think that goes either way. I mean, if we don't pass it, what we would look at is kind of a similar thing, a big study to kind of look at, what the problem is, what is it we're trying to fix, what's the best solution to do that? And then there's also the question, which we hadn't gotten into, about the issue with unclassified employees being able to engage in political activity, which they can now, versus civil servants who cannot do that. And so I think there's a question, do we need to address that if, in the future, if, again, we take large groups of people and make them unclassified?
We have a question from somebody saying that this was initially discussed in the context of attorneys and engineers and moving them from some sort of classified civil service to unclassified. And the person is asking if this is still the case and if it's connected to any transportation projects that are planned or underway. And I guess I would just say, I think that is one thing we don't yet know. The amendment just authorizes the legislature to move some jobs to the unclassified civil service, but what those jobs will be, how it would be handled, all of that would be determined later in follow-up legislation if this amendment passes. So a lot of those questions won't be answered until we learn the fate of this amendment and then what the legislature decides to do in response. Also, I'm just going to say we have a couple people saying that they're having issues with their audio. We don't on this end, so I'm not really sure. It must be something with your individual computers. So make sure to turn off your microphones and let's move on to Amendment 2.
Alrighty. Amendment 2. Want to pull it up, Alex? All right, I'm not going to read all that. This is essentially, there is in East Baton Rouge Parish, there is a municipality, a relatively new one, St. George. St. George now wants to have their own school district, but you need a constitutional amendment to do that. We can talk about why that is in the details. Basically, you need a constitutional amendment. It has to pass both the state as a whole and also in East Baton Rouge Parish for this to happen, for the municipality of St. George to have an overlapping school district. And there's a lot of discussion about that, particularly if you live in East Baton Rouge Parish. People like in, Washington may not care. But Melinda?
Okay, and so this is the place to say that the amendment for it to pass has to pass specifically in East Baton Rouge Parish in addition to passing statewide. Um, so Barry, I'm going to start with you on this one. I know y'all have taken no position on this one. Can you talk through a little bit about what sort of the ongoing discussion has been at the Capitol, since I know education is an area you closely follow?
Yeah, well, I mean, background wise, this has been a big issue in this area for a long time. And, historically, here in East Baton Rouge, we've actually got four school districts, the parish district, and then three kind of community districts. And, historically, as the legislature has looked at this, they have basically kind of said, if you're going to do this, you need to kind of create a municipality to do it around. So you had Zachary, which is a community central, which kind of created itself as community Baker, and do all that. St. George kind of has gone through that same process. They kind of wanted to try and do it without that, but they've gone ahead and created a separate, incorporated area to allow them to create this school district. So it's been a lot of back and forth. I mean, the legislature passed this stuff, pretty easily. Obviously, it's a constitutional amendment. It got on the ballot pretty easily, as well as the fact that, there's some companion legislation which actually sets up the district and all this, but you need the constitutional amendment to give them access to MFP dollars. That's the state funding, the ability to raise taxes, school textbooks and those types of things. So this is an implementation aspect of it. So the district is kind of ready to go, but it needs this amendment to pass to actually make it functional.
Okay, and not surprisingly, Daniel and Jan have different perspectives on this one. So, Daniel, we'll start with you. Pelican is in support. Can you talk through why?
Yeah, this gets back to a question of, well, it raises a couple of questions. The first is, why does the whole state have to decide whether, this relationship between St. George and East Baton Rouge Parish it will evolve the way that they'd like it to? That goes back to the broader constitutional reforms that, a lot of us have been discussing. But in this case, this is the voters have established St. George as a community. The legislature, through its process, of course, as Stephen recognized, has broadly supported this amendment to put it on the ballot. And we believe the people of St. George, if they want this school district, this is just a great, again, reminder that these education decisions are best made by the people closest to the voters, to the taxpayers. And so we support the ability of St. George. And again, there's precedent for this, as you noted, with Baker and Zachary and Central. This is not new. St. George went through the first process, and this is the sort of final piece of the puzzle for those folks who have been organizing for a long time.
Yeah, and talk through your concerns and opposition on this one in particular.
I don't know where to start on this one because there is so much wrong with this amendment and this plan. But as Barry said, this has been a debate in our community here. I live in East Baton Rouge for a decade and a half. And when the city of St. George was created in 2019, the only people who got to vote on that were the people in the majority white, wealthier suburbs that elected to incorporate, even though that decision impacted the entire parish. And we're seeing it result in big budget shortfalls in East Baton Rouge and cuts to various services. So this election on May 16th is different because everybody in East Baton Rouge gets to vote, and it's the only chance the citizens of East Baton Rouge will ever, who live outside St. George, who are very impacted by this school district, will have a chance to vote on this. So let's talk first about what it will mean to the existing East Baton Rouge school district that would be left behind. And for that, it would be a budget disaster. They would lose about 12% of their students, but about 1/4 of the funding. So the latest projection that I've seen is that would create about a $54 million shortfall when you include the $17 million in MFP funding, state funding that would leave. You're looking at a $71 million budget gap. So if you have a student, and I have 2 students in East Baton Rouge Public Schools, you are looking at probably larger class sizes, fewer services, fewer resources going into a district that will be poorer and more heavily African American than the one that gets carved out. If you're a family in St. George, then you're frankly going to have a lot fewer choices in your children's education because you're going to lose access to some of the good things that are happening in East Baton Rouge Public Schools. The law that funds this, that the implementation law says that St. George students will have the right to attend East Baton Rouge Parish magnet schools. There's some very high performing, some of the best schools in the public schools in the state are going to be in East Baton Rouge. Those kids, if you're in that school right now, you can stay in that school. But if you're going to move from middle school to high school, for example, yes, you have a right to apply, but you're going to be at the back of the line. So if you're in St. George, you are going to lose access to those programs. You're going to lose access to the gifted programs. And if you have a student with exceptionalities and you need special education, there's going to be a lot of fewer resources available to you in St. George than if you stayed. Then there's just the broader question of what kind of community we want to be. The Brookings Institute recently they have a project they call Metro Monitor, and they ranked 55 large metro areas on a number of economic factors. And East Baton Rouge Parish came 55th, dead last on their measure of economic inclusion, because East Baton Rouge is a parish with a lot of rich and a lot of poor and deep economic and racial divides that have persisted for generations. And what this does is it takes those divisions and it makes them more stark, makes us more divided. And so this takes the entire community in the wrong direction. It's bad for the kids in East Baton Rouge. It's bad for the families in St. George. And it's the only opportunity that the voters of this community have to weigh in on this St. George debate. And if you're outside of East Baton Rouge, I think this will, if this passes, it's going to give rise to copycat initiatives in other areas of the state. So I think if you don't think this can happen, this only affects East Baton Rouge, it might be coming for your community next.
Okay. think Jan has strong feelings about this one.
I do.
I will say we have a question from someone asking, why aren't we pulling the creation of school districts out of the Constitution altogether? That is a whole different webinar in terms of like the debates over constitutional change writ large. The legislature is constantly sort of debating and thinking through ways to rewrite constitutional provisions. You'd have to go to the legislature and ask them why they haven't done this separately, but they'd have to fundamentally change the language of the Constitution to do that. So, on that note, let's move on to Amendment 3, which is also complicated.
Yeah. It was nice actually when I talked to places outside of East Baton Rouge. Like I've been, we've talked to Lafayette and New Orleans and Homa and Terrebonne. It's like it is so easy to talk about the amendment number 2 because it's like, look, this affects East Baton Rouge Parish, and then they're like, okay, all right. Amendment number 3 is teacher pay. All right, at a high level, this is relatively easy. This would give an increase to um, to teachers and support staff. They would get a pay raise and it would be permanent. They have a temporary stipend right now, but this would become a permanent and actually at a higher level. That's the high level. A little more complicated is the mechanics. The way that this money is generated is that we will essentially liquidate 3 trust funds, use about $2 billion to pay down debt in the teacher's pension system, teacher's retirement system. And just like you pay down a debt, you don't have to make the interest payments or you pay lower interest payments. And then that savings essentially will then be put toward these pay raises. There are some pay raises and some parishes and school systems that won't get quite enough in the savings, but then the state will make them whole. And those parishes that have more than they need can spend it on a variety of different things that are listed in the legislation. So that's a very high level. Happy to talk about more detail, but I think that basically it's the pay raise, and we get there by paying down debt using interest savings.
Okay, I think there's one thing I'm going to add before I start asking y'all questions, which is currently the interest earnings and investment earnings from those funds pay for other things across early childhood, K-12, and higher education. So if they liquidate these trust funds, they will have to, or at least they say they will be looking for ways to fill the gaps and continue covering those other items from early childhood education all the way through higher education. Okay, so with that groundwork laid, Jan, I'm going to start with you on this one. I know y'all are in opposition to this amendment. Can you talk through why?
Sure. Well, let's start with the fact that the voters were faced with this question a little bit over a year ago, and when it was it was known as Amendment 2 on the ballot. It was a very similar idea, and the voters rejected that by a 2-1 margin. So that's for starters. I think, and the second thing I think people need to understand is when they see a $2,000, $2,250 pay raise. You have to do the net because what is being lost in the state budget is the $2,000 stipend that teachers have been receiving for the past 3 years. So when you take away a $2,000 stipend and you add a $2,250 the pay raise, it's a pay raise of $250. So if you are a teacher, and my wife teaches, she's teaching school right now, you get a pay raise that is really less than the rate of inflation quite a bit. So teachers should not be expecting a windfall. I think the broader question here is, this prepayment of debt. It's always nice to prepay retirement debt, but we're really repaying this debt we're talking about is already on track to be paid off in 3 years. So we're paying this debt off. We've been paying it off under a constitutional amendment that was passed a generation ago. And we're giving up a permanent financing stream. More broadly, the legislature has decided to take itself out of the business of paying teachers adequately. Louisiana's teachers are paid $5,000 below the regional average, more than $10,000 below the national average. They are underpaid by virtually any measure. And the legislature should really be raising the dollars and making sure teachers are paid adequately so that they can stay in the classroom and be rewarded for the great work they're doing. There's good things happening in public education. Our test scores are up. Our performance scores are up. and we're just not doing enough to make sure that they're rewarded for their great work.
Okay, Barry, can you talk through why y'all are in support of this amendment?
Yeah, well, I would just say, to Jan's point, I think what we're kind of faced with this amendment are two good policy ideas, and it's just kind of balancing two. I mean, one, I think it is great to have, $2 billion in trust fund revenue sources available, for education at all levels. I mean, I think that is really good. It's also always really good to pay down debt. And get that off the books, and as kind of lagniappe, I guess you could say, the teachers would have this pay stipend become permanent with a little bit added on extra there. I think between the two balancing things, we felt like it was a good idea to pay off the debt and get that teacher issue taken care of, at least for the time being. But that said, I do think we have concerns about where those dollars that are now flowing out of the trust funds into early childhood, K-12, and higher education, making sure that those will be made up or at least be accounted for kind of made whole. Now, that does happen pretty much with what we're talking about in early childhood because there's some legislation that was passed to take care of that. And what we hear is, that the savings that higher ed accrues, that they accrue those savings and they could redirect those dollars or whatever. The question is, will that be the case in the future? And so obviously we are supportive, but kind of with the caveat that we're saying to the legislature, we're okay with doing this, but really we don't want to just supplant these funds. We want to make sure that those are available in the future for the good things that they're actually doing. And really in higher ed, it's really been critical because it's all a bit about, for them, talent. Professors, endowed chairs, those types of things, which have private matches to a lot of those things. So it's really, a significant thing for higher education in particular when we're talking about, again, really top-notch talent, research dollars, research proposals, and that type of thing.
Okay, and I will mention just that the Appropriations Chairman, Jack McFarland, said recently, if this passes, they have to come up with about, his estimate was $50 million to supplant some of these various things and fill in gaps for the school systems and charter schools that don't actually have enough money to fully cover the teacher pay raise required. And somebody has asked in the Q&A about actuarial assumptions and whether this amendment does anything regarding actuarial assumptions or just pays down the debt. I can tell you it just pays down the debt. It doesn't touch any of the other situations ongoing with the retirement system. Now, Daniel, your turn to explain Pelican is in support. Talk us through why, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a win-win-win all around for everybody. I mean, I was raised on Dave Ramsey and this idea that we shouldn't be a state that has a whole lot of debt. We shouldn't be a place that that has money set aside but isn't paying down debt. The reality is the interest payments we're making on the debt is more than the interest that the revenue that is being generated to from the interest on the trust funds in order to fill those current funds. The other thing, and not surprisingly, Jan and I have a pretty deep disagreement on this, is we need to remember that teachers are employees of their local school board. So the notion that the state should be responsible primarily for the questions of teacher pay and whether it's too low is just flat wrong. These are decisions that ought to be made by local school boards. So I think the other benefit of this is it reminds us it's paying off debt that the school boards are responsible for. By the way, create a problem largely created by the legislature in that regard and in the structure of the pension systems, which we have not yet solved. So it's true also that this is scheduled to be paid off in the next 3 years. That's just this part of it. The broader pension obligations are much more substantial. We need to be putting as many resources as we can toward debt reduction in order to free up payments, free up that debt service and the recurring spending, as well as to get ahead of the challenges we know are ahead once we get a handle on that. So I think this is a win in that it makes permanent a teacher pay raise. Jan, I don't disagree that teachers are underpaid. The challenge is we're spending broadly between all sources more per child in our public school systems in any of our neighboring states and not paying our teachers as much. So it's not a question of there not being enough money in the system. The question is, how are we prioritizing it? Is it to teachers in the classroom, or is it to administrators and overhead, or some unknown other option? So this pays off debt. That's great. It relieves the school boards of a significant burden of debt payment. It allows them to make these teacher stipends permanent. And then it also, again, I think recenters the conversation. If you believe, like probably Jan and I both do, that teachers who are doing incredibly hard work in the classroom, there's no doubt there has been improvement across the board, need to be paid more. That's a conversation you need to have with your local school board, who can be best responsive to the people and responsive to their own budgets.
Okay, we have somebody asking if we can repeat where the pay increase will come from. So essentially, we have three big education trust funds. They would be liquidated. That money would be used to pay off about $2 billion in retirement debt. And the K through 12 school systems will get savings because they have to pay less for retirement costs. And then we'll use that savings to then help cover the permanent teacher pay increase. So that is that answer. Somebody asked, and this is an interesting question, wouldn't increasing teacher pay also increase the retirement liabilities?
I'm,
Stephen?
I'm going to take that one. Okay. Yes, increasing teacher pay would increase the liabilities. However, because they have a higher pay and they pay um, a percentage of their salary, there would also be more assets going to cover that. Now, I don't know if it's going to be perfectly balanced, but that's how it works in general.
Okay. Now let's move on to amendment number 4.
All right. You thought the last couple were complicated. All right. Number 4, at a high level, this would give local governments, parish governments, the option to reduce property taxes on inventory for business. So it doesn't necessarily do it. It gives locals the option. Okay, but I have to fill in a little bit more. So it's also called an inventory tax. An inventory tax is not a separate thing. It is just the property tax that you pay. And in our state, inventory is counted as property. That's not true in every state. Louisiana is one of, I think, 7 states that fully taxes inventory. Um, when if you decide as a local government to reduce this tax, depending on how you do it, you might get a payment from the state. That amount depends on how quickly you take, if you remove it all in one year or remove it over several years, and also how much tax you were paying over time. Lastly, the groups that decide this are sort of the parish-wide ones. It has to be agreed to by the sheriff, by the school board, and by whatever the parish government says, whether that's a police jury or parish council, whatever it is. So that's the groups that decide whatever this is, and you can eliminate it or you can reduce it. But if you reduce it or eliminate it, you cannot then go back. This is a one-way ratcheting. I
Okay.
left out a lot of stuff, so please fill in the details.
So Daniel, I believe Pelican is in support of this one. So can you talk through what you support about this? And can you maybe also touch on what the state's payment structure would be as an incentive for this?
Yeah, again, this is one where it's hard to find something to be against, at least from our perspective. I'm sure my friend Jan will find something. As Melinda and Stephen both said, this is a relatively unique tax for our state, one of only a handful of states who levy it. This is a tax that you pay as a business, whether you make money or lose money. And we think about it often in terms of the larger payers, whether you're a large manufacturer or a car dealer, for example. This affects everyone on down to small grocery stores, neighborhood bookshops, all across the board, the businesses, the retail establishments that we all enjoy the opportunity to shop. And so, this is, of course, a disincentive to raising wages. This is a disincentive to bringing business here to begin with, and it limits options for consumers. Of course, as we know, corporate taxes are passed on both to employers and customers of that business. So this is, taxes on these kinds of things are particularly onerous to an economy. This is, I think certainly if I were king of the world, you would just eliminate the ability to levy the inventory tax altogether. However, I think this is a perfectly fair and good compromise to uh, let local parishes and as Stephen said, all of those have to agree, make a decision and compete among themselves as enterprises moving into the state. It gives a chance for one parish over another to make a sales pitch that, maybe you ought to locate your business here instead of there. Competition of that regard lifts everyone and creates opportunity for a lot more people. So, I think giving that option, removing the mandatory, I mean, the idea that we mandate a collection of a tax in a state constitution is kind of crazy also. We should allow or disallow, but not mandate. Um, but so that that works really well in terms of the payout. What the state basically has done is, as Steven said, say depending on how quickly you phase it out or eliminate it, and the amount that you pay, the state's going to come and backfill that for a couple of years. So it gives a local government a chance to sort of wean off that money and the reliance on that money. It's worth noting two other things. One, there's only about 15 or so parishes in the state that have a really substantial percentage of their collections come from the inventory tax. Certainly, every parish has some collections there that are going to have to, and those are real challenges, right? Those are dollars in that they've planned on and budgeted for. So it's not to suggest there aren't some real conversations and challenging decisions to be made. However, what we know is economic growth will increase tax collections on sales tax, other property tax, and other ways that local government collects revenue. It's also important to note that this is one of these issues that has been sort of a typical Louisiana way of dealing with a problem. There's been a broad range of understanding that the inventory tax is particularly punishing and that it probably should go away. But rather than take on, what I would call a sort of entrenched status quo special interest in the lobbyists for local governments, the state said, well, what we'll do is we'll just create a tax credit for this. And so, that's a whole other webinar as well, of course, on tax policy. But this is several $100 million a year. The state basically is an expensive subsidy of local government because it has to pass through collections into the state and then reimburse taxpayers in the form of a tax credit for what they paid to their local government. So if local governments have want to raise other taxes or have that discussion, there's mechanisms for the people to make those decisions and approve or reject those. But this tax is particularly bad in the terms of tax policy. It's particularly damaging to the economy and giving the locals the ability to remove it and providing some incentive out of state savings is a good idea all around.
Okay, we have someone asking where the one-time payment would come from. So this is where I step in and just say, the Department of Revenue has estimated that the state would owe parishes anywhere from 218 million to 563 million, depending on how many parishes would choose to stop charging the property tax on business inventory and how they would do it. And the payments they could get are anywhere from $500,000 to 15 million, depending on how much they charge, how they get rid of it, etc. Whatever payments the state would make would come from the Revenue Stabilization Trust Fund, which is a trust fund we have that currently has about $2.4 billion. So there's enough money in there to cover the potential cost here.
And if I can, Melinda, just a quick note, that is an addition, just so folks aren't confused, to what we commonly call the rainy day fund. So there are two large savings accounts in state government right now.
Very good point. This is not going to get at the one that we use if we have budget deficits and all of those kind of things. Thank you, because that is very key. So Jan, not shockingly, you don't have the same opinion as Daniel on this. So can you talk through your opposition, your organization's opposition to Amendment 4, please?
Sure. And look, this amendment is not about small independent bookstores. This is about large industrial corporations, petrochem. Stephen's right. Or Daniel's right. There's, about a few parishes that rely heavily on this property tax. I'll say one thing I agree with Daniel on is that the inventory tax credit should probably go away. Yeah, a lot of it does go away, frankly, under the tax bill law that passed last year. But these are property taxes, and frankly, Louisiana already has the most generous property tax incentives for manufacturing corporations that we have that exist anywhere in the country with the ITEP program. What this does essentially is say, if you want to get rid of your inventory property tax, then we'll give you a one-time payment in exchange for getting rid of a permanent revenue source. My guess is that if this passes, a lot of the big parishes that get a lot of money from this tax is going to say thanks, but no thanks. We want to keep things just as they are. And some of the smaller ones will take that little, one-time carrot in hopes of, getting, get the one-time payment, get rid of a revenue source permanently, which is, I think one problem with this is that parishes should have the ability to decide if they want to raise this. But let's just say a parish, and there are some good checks and balances built into this, decides to get rid of this permanent revenue source. They take the one-time payment. Local governments have very few choices in how to raise revenue. They essentially have sales taxes and property taxes. So if you get rid of a permanent revenue source that you get from property taxes paid by corporations, one of two things will happen. You either have to, cut spending, cut money that goes to programs, local schools, local parks, local police, the things that we buy with our local taxes, or alternatively, you have to make up that revenue in some other way, which means raising taxes on other people, property taxes on homeowners, sales taxes, fees, how other ways. So you're either shifting the tax burden away from corporations onto families, or you're telling you're going to have less revenue available. I think both of those are worse alternatives than having corporations pay a tax, especially when many of them benefit from, again, the most friendly corporate tax breaks that exist anywhere in the country. It's why we have such a huge industrial footprint here, or one of the reasons.
Oh, you're on mute, Melinda.
Sorry. Now we'll move to Barry. And I just want to say, if you see Barry flailing about every so often in the corner of your screen, it's because he's got lights that automatically turn off and he kind of keeps putting them back on. So in case anybody is wondering if Barry is having a seizure, he is not.
It could be
We're
both.
very
Just throwing
energy
that out there.
efficient around here, but it does come at a price.
But Barry, I believe Leaders for a Better Louisiana is in support of this amendment. So can you talk through why you disagree with Jan?
Well, I don't disagree with Jan in the nature of just disagreeing with Jan. Now, I mean, honestly, I don't see a real downside to doing this. It's an optional thing for communities to make a decision among themselves. I mean, honestly, as Daniel was saying, the business inventory tax, it's a part of our tax that, a lot of states do not have to the degree that we do. And as we go through all the studies that we've done over the years from, our group and PAR and, Tax Foundation, this thing comes up over and over and over again as kind of an outlier. It is difficult to get rid of because, one, it is a local tax and it can only really be done through constitutional means. And two, some of these governments are very, very dependent upon it. So it is difficult to deal with. So this gives folks an option to try this if they want to. I will say, maybe, some of these parishes certainly won't be able to do that because of their dependence on the revenue. But, you do have other parishes where maybe it's not a huge sum of revenue. And besides getting the one-time payment that they would get from the state to kind of offset some things, they may also want to do it to make their own tax situation more competitive in their region. Maybe there's somebody that's looking to come into their parish and somewhere else does not have an inventory tax. This parish does. Well, they may want to make a decision that, hey, we want to either reduce it or get rid of it and make ourselves more competitive for this economic development project. So they ought to have that flexibility to be able to do that. And frankly, it's kind of dumb that we have so much of this stuff in the Constitution that does not give the local governments the ability to make those kind of changes without going to voters to get permission to do that. And this would actually kind of give them more flexibility on a permanent basis, than they have now. And I think that's a good thing.
What about Jan's point that the decision is irrevocable? And so this set of groups of elected officials, the local elected officials, will make a decision that locks them in, that locks the parish in perpetuity.
Well, I mean, I think you're right about that. It does do that in this type of thing. But again, I think when I look at it, I don't see some of these parishes that have huge amounts of dollars and really heavy reliance being the parishes that are going to do that. I see the ones that have kind of a marginal, value to it where, you could really see offsetting, the what you're getting in that revenue from a more economic development competitive situation. And actually, maybe that helps you yield more dollars. But again, it's a decision you make. And you're right. At least on that one, it would be a permanent decision.
I I would just say real quickly that if you don't make it irrevocable, what happens is people repeal it, take the money, and then put it back in place. So I think to the extent there's an incentive to roll off, you've got to make it irrevocable.
Okay. Before we move on to Constitutional Amendment 5, I just want to let everybody watching know that in the chat, Alex, our communications director, has posted PAR's guide to the constitutional amendments, also Leaders for a Better Louisiana's guide and recommendations, and Pelican's guide and recommendations. And I know Invest in Louisiana is going to have a guide that is published soon, I think in the next couple weeks, but definitely before early voting starts on May 2nd. Correct, Jan?
Absolutely.
And can you tell everybody Invest's website so they can find your guide if they would like to?
Absolutely. Investlouisiana.org.
Okay, great. So moving on, Stephen, let's do Amendment 5, which might be one of the simpler ones.
Yes, this is certainly compared to the last two. This one has to do with the election age for judges. So right now, if you are a judge, you cannot run for office if you are 70 or older. This would increase that to 75. So be clear, you don't get kicked out of office, you turn 70, 71, or if you turn 76, you just cannot run for office once you hit the threshold. And pretty simply, it moves the number from 70 to 75.
Okay, and I will say that in our research, what we could find is that 31 states have a mandatory retirement age for judges. That's from the National Center for State Courts. And it varies all over the place. Some of them are 70 years old and some are as much as 90 years old. So with that, we only have one organization out of the three who've taken a position on this one. So Barry, I'm going to start with you on Leaders is supporting this amendment. Can you explain why?
Yeah, well, like as the oldest person on the webinar, we think old people should be able to work. Um, well, that's an extrapolation of maybe our broader view or a narrowing of our broader view. Now, actually, I mean, you're right, Melinda. It is kind of all over the map around the country, and 70 is the low end of the spectrum, and most of them are actually older. When you look at the ones that don't have an age limit at all, and then you add the others where 75 is kind of more of the sweet spot for some of the others. We're at the younger end of the spectrum with that. Actually, it was 75 before we did our Constitution in 1974, and then we reduced it there in the Constitution. But I mean, I think broadly speaking, I mean, we all know that life expectancy is increased, professional work expectancy is definitely increased. I think a lot of our folks felt like there is value with institutional, knowledge that's built in from folks that have been in the system a long time, and this includes attorneys who I think have to deal with these judges, quite a bit themselves. So it would raise it to 75. It would still put us pretty much, yeah, I would say in the sweet spot of states where there is an age limit, and just think that from where we stand with so many things today, that it just seems like the right thing to do and a good thing to do as well.
Okay, and this is sort of our kumbaya moment between Jan and Daniel because your organizations have taken no position, so you're at least not at odds here. Jan, can you talk through just any thoughts you have about this amendment and why y'all decided that you didn't need to wade into this one?
Yeah, well, our organization's policy focus is on low and moderate income communities, so this is really not in our policy wheelhouse at all. Well, we don't. So for that reason, we just it doesn't make sense for us to take a position. I will say, just on a personal level, I don't understand why this needs to be in the Constitution at all. I think voters are perfectly capable of deciding whether a judge is too old to serve and should have that. So if I were king for a day, I'd probably take this out of the Constitution altogether and leave this to the wisdom of the voters. But as it stands, we don't really have a recommendation.
Okay, and Daniel at least might agree with Jan about taking stuff out of the Constitution on this one,
I was
but
gonna say, mark it down. Jan's for the Constitutional Convention, so that's what we heard.
Well, let's not go too far.
Oh, I thought I'd lean in. We'd be friends.
Daniel, can you sort of talk through any thoughts that you have? I know Pelican hasn't actually taken a position.
Yeah, for similar reasons that Jan noted, this isn't something right in our core expertise or wheelhouse. I will just point out a couple of facts. This is an amendment that has been on the similar amendments have been on the ballot before here in Louisiana, both in 1995 and 2014. Both of those amendments failed. And in 95, interestingly, it failed in 62 out of 64 parishes. Only two parishes had a majority yes. So this is a concept that voters have in Louisiana in particular have historically rejected. I looked around the country as well. I think there were 11 similar attempts in states over the last handful of years, and only one of those was approved by voters. So I think generally voters are pretty skeptical, and especially with judges that have no term limits. Voters have applied term limits to many of the other political offices, most of the other political offices. This is a position with no term limits, and the Supreme Court justice, for example, has a term of 10 years. Um, so in this case, someone could serve until they were 85 years old, being elected right before one's 74th or 75th birthday. That said, many of Barry's points are certainly well taken. And I think this is one just voters typically tend to be pretty skeptical of letting people serve longer. Maybe there's a reason there's a reason for that. But I'll be with Jan when we're ready to take things out of the Constitution.
Okay, if anybody wants to start singing Kumbaya, now is your moment.
We saved the good stuff for last.
That's right.
And on a happy note.
Well, so we do have a question about Amendment 5, and I don't know if this is something we would necessarily be equipped to answer, but I'm going to ask, somebody's asking if Amendment 5 is likely to disproportionately affect Black judges. I don't know that. I mean, I know we don't have any data at par about judges' ages by race or judges' ages in terms of how many of them we have who are hitting the 70 versus 75 mark in office currently. So, but if anybody on the Zoom has different information, please let me know. But I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to answer that one for you.
Can't help you.
Okay. We do have, let's see. Somebody is asking that maybe the state should be proposing something to provide more ethical responsibility for judges regardless of age. That is not what this amendment is dealing with at all. This is purely about the judge's age and whether they should be uh, able to serve longer until the age of 75. So I'm sorry we're not going to be able to help in that regard. I would like to, we have a few minutes left and we had a bunch of questions on Amendment 1, the civil service one that came in after the fact. Not shockingly, people are not entirely sure about this one. So I'm going to try and answer a couple of those questions. Um, Somebody is asking if this would cause more people to retire, and if that would have impacts on the lasers retirement system and unfunded liability issues involving lasers, because perhaps if a position gets changed from classified to unclassified, somebody might want to retire rather than take the different position. Stephen, do you want to talk about
Yeah, so I
lasers?
think it's still, first of all, an open question that if an individual is in a position that gets moved to an unclassified position, whether or not they would lose their protections, or if those are already granted, that's a lawsuit to work out in the future. So I think that's an open question. But let's assume that it's not the case, that they might have to give up their position, in which case you might see some retirements, and early retirements tend to cost a little bit more, because you're expecting people to work, and then they might retire sooner and start drawing their benefits sooner. But I don't know that that's a huge note. It's really going to depend on, first of all, if that's true. I know other states that have moved away from civil service have sort of grandfathered everyone in. I think Georgia is the big example I know of. They grandfathered everyone in. I think they did this like in the 90s, and they still have some people in civil service. So I don't know that it's going to be an exodus, but anyone that retires sooner than you thought does cost the retirement systems money.
Okay, great to have a retirement expert on this one. Um, so we also have a question about whether or not Amendment 1 would allow the legislature to change the top classified staff of an entire agency, and whether the legislature could replace people in those jobs. I think I just want to say that some of those questions we don't know because we haven't seen what the implications are. But Barry, Jan, Daniel, anybody have thoughts about, you know, whether the legislature could just change all of the classified staff to unclassified staff?
Well, it would
I,
seem like it has the potential to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an attorney, but kind of the way that it's worded, it talks about, there goes my light. Did it in prime time. Um, I mean, the way it talks about positions, employees, and what is it, officers is the other term. It's pretty broad. I mean, it seems like it would have that potential. But again, again, probably have to wait and see to get something more specific on that.
I agree with Barry. I think it opens up, it gives a lot of power to the state legislature to decide. And so we don't know what the legislature would do, but certainly they could decide that an entire agency should just be taken out of. I mean, the legislature itself, all of the employees there are unclassified. They're political appointees. They could certainly make that decision, and that's, I think, gets to the heart of our concern about the amendment itself. I don't think it's a coincidence that this came along at a time when we have very consolidated one-party rule in state government. For generations, it was Democrats who ruled everything in Louisiana. We had a period there for about, 20, 25 years when there was really divided government. But now we have a supermajority Republican control of the legislature, Republican governor. And this would be an opportunity, if the legislature wanted to say, hey, we just want, our ideological soulmates running this state government really down to the agency granular level. And I think that would has the potential to take away a lot of career expertise at the agency level.
Okay, Daniel, you'll get the last word on this one.
yeah, I'll be quick. I think that. No, I mean, is it possible? I don't disagree with Jan or Barry that it could be likelihood. I mean, despite supermajority numbers, this legislature doesn't agree on a whole lot, even between the chambers, or between the various chambers and the governor. So, the idea of doing something that drastic seems highly unlikely. And that's the beauty of the legislative process, that it gets to be aired in open debate. People get to come and testify and weigh in. None of that gets to happen currently in the current civil service structure. And I'll mention that I've talked to a number of agency leads who support this, not because of the ability to get rid of people or something like that, but rather because they have superstars that they'd really like to promote and to pay more and able to retain, and they're really unable to do that based on the current structure. So I think this has a ton of upsides. Like everything, there's always a what if or they could possibly, but by and large, this is a win for state workers. It's a win for the agencies, and it's a win for the balance of power to give the people's elected official in the legislature the ability to make these decisions.
Daniel, you may have the distinction of being the only person I've ever heard call the legislative process beautiful. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen for, for some
Wait, I
final
think
questions.
Jan said
No,
he
no,
knew
no.
the
I
answer to whether
don't
people
know.
in
I don't need
Vegas
to answer
live.
that. I was.
I would love to see that. I think you actually probably found it on some like Poly Market. Not
Somebody
Vegas.
asked, for those watching, somebody asked, do you have Las Vegas odds on the fate of each amendment? And Jan seemed to be interested in this
I
one.
did live in Las Vegas, so I do love to. I love a good betting line. I'm going to probably put it at about even money right now. That's what makes these elections very
He's got
exciting
some
and
side hustle going, is what I hear. So one last question to sort of wrap it up. If you would think about the amendment you have, you either want to pass or you don't want to pass. Either you think it's going to be beneficial for the state or you have concerns. So the one that you care about the most, either way. And I don't particularly care in order. Let's go. I'm just picking Jan to go first because he's the way he's on my screen.
Amendment 2 is the one that we care about the most.
And
And
that's the St.
this is
George one.
St. George. Absolutely. This is just bad public policy. It's one of those things that's bad for both sides for different reasons and would set a really bad precedent.
Okay. Daniel?
Gosh, it's sort of a toss-up between 3 and 4, but I'll say 4. I think the getting the tax policy right has the biggest upside of really keeping the state moving in the right direction economically. We've got some significant challenges to overcome, so I'd say
Okay.
the passage of
That
4
was the giving locals the option on
on
inventory tax.
inventory tax. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, Bear, you get sort of the last say on what you think, the amendment you care about the most.
I would agree with Daniel, actually. This is a nut we've been trying to crack for a very long time, and this is not the end all and be all solution, but it is a step in that direction, and it'd be great if we could make some progress uh, trying to deal with that particular tax.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. I want to really thank the panelists. I think y'all did a great job. Multiple, points of view, disagreeing, but in a civil way. I love it. I personally enjoy it. I think, we're already seeing participants telling us they liked it as well. Um, Thank y'all so much. And then we will be posting this on YouTube for the people that missed it, so we'll be able to watch it there. And then next month, I think we're talking about the birthday of the United States. So we'll have I think, yeah, a good panel for that as well. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have a great weekend.
You too.